My daddy has that same ring, the little girl whispered, her voice cutting through the thick cigar smoke like a silver bell. But he told me yours is just the hollow shell. The private lounge went deathly still. A moment ago, the room was a storm of heavy ambition, the clinking of crystal decanters, the low rumble of men discussing territory, and the scent of expensive leather. But as Van Lake turned his head, the sound seemed to drain out of the world. Standing by the mahogany table was a girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. She wore a simple, faded floral dress and sneakers that had seen better days, a jarring, fragile contrast to the sharp-suited vultures surrounding her. Van Lake looked down at the heavy obsidian signet on his hand. It was the founding eye, a ring that supposedly proved his right to lead the syndicate. No one outside the original brotherhood even knew of its existence, and the man who wore it before him was supposed to have burned to ash 20 years ago. "What did you just say?" Van Lake asked, his voice steady, but his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs. The girl didn't flinch. She simply reached into her pocket and held out a small, worn velvet box. "He said you'd be wearing the decoy," she said softly. "He said the real one is the key, and you're just holding the door shut." As the lid of the box clicked open, Van Lake felt the floor tilt beneath him. There, nestled in the fabric, was a twin to his ring, except this one caught the light with a depth of color his own stone lacked. In that single silent gesture, the powerful Mafia boss realized his entire empire was built on a lie, and the brother he had betrayed 20 years ago had been watching him from the shadows all along. The silence in the private lounge was no longer empty. It was heavy, pressing against Van Lake's chest like the weight of a collapsing building. He stared at the small, worn velvet box in the girl's hand, his vision tunneling until the rest of the room. The scowling lieutenants, the haze of expensive cigars, the glint of crystal, simply ceased to exist. Inside that box sat a twin to the obsidian signet on his own finger, a ring he had worn for 2 decades as the ultimate symbol of his right to rule. "My daddy said you'd be wearing the decoy," Ilera repeated, her voice steady enough to make his blood run cold. Van Lake reached out, his hand trembling with a weakness he hadn't felt since he was a desperate boy on the streets. He took the box, his thumb brushing against the obsidian stone. It was deeper, darker, and more vibrant than his own. He realized with a sickening lurch of the heart that the founding eye he had displayed so proudly was nothing more than lead and glass, a clever forgery meant to keep a traitor occupied while the truth remained hidden. The realization hit him like a physical blow, tilting the world off its axis. 20 years ago, he had watched the warehouse in the docks go up in flames, certain that Silas Thorne, his mentor and the closest thing he had to a father, was inside. He had paid for the confirmation, stared at the charred remains, and convinced himself the debt was settled. But looking at Ilera's eyes, eyes that held the same quiet, discerning steel that Silas once possessed, he knew he had been a fool. "Where is he?" Van Lake whispered, the words catching in a throat that had gone bone dry. "He's gone now," Ilera said, a flicker of grief finally softening her gaze. "But he told me to find the man who kept the fake ring. He said you were the only one left who might remember what the word loyalty actually felt like." Van Lake looked back at his men, the vultures who served him out of fear rather than love. He saw them watching the girl, their eyes narrowing with a greed that signaled the beginning of the end. Silas hadn't just survived. He had lived a life of peace while Van Lake lived a life of gilded lies. The ghost of Silas Thorne hadn't come for revenge. He had sent a child to offer a final, devastating chance at redemption. Van Lake felt the eyes of his lieutenants drilling into the back of his neck, their silent judgment heavier than the smoke lingering in the air. He ignored them, focusing entirely on the 2 objects now resting in his palm. He slid the obsidian signet off his own finger, the ring he had used to command respect, to sign death warrants, and to seal the alliances that built his empire. Beside it, the ring Ilera had brought seemed to pulse with a dark, inner light. He brought them both toward the desk lamp, the light catching the stones. At a distance, they were identical, but under the harsh glow, the deception began to crumble. Van Lake picked up a heavy silver letter opener and, with a hand that refused to stay perfectly still, struck the edge of his own ring. Instead of the clear, melodic ring of high-grade obsidian, it produced a dull, hollow thud. He pressed the tip of the blade into the underside of the band. The metal peeled away like soft wax, revealing a base of cheap lead. The breath left his lungs in a ragged hiss. For 20 years, he had been a king wearing a costume jewelry crown. He had killed for this symbol, lied for it, and lived every day in the shadow of the man he thought he'd replaced. But Silas Thorne had known. Even as the warehouse burned, Silas had known that Van's greed would make him reach for the nearest shiny object without ever questioning its substance. He turned his attention to the second ring. When he struck it, the stone sang, a sharp, pure vibration that resonated through his very bones. As he turned it over, he saw what he had missed on his own, a microscopic hinge, invisible to the naked eye. He pressed the specific point on the inner band, a trick Silas had once whispered about in a drunken moment of brotherhood he'd long since dismissed as a myth. The stone clicked upward, revealing a hollow chamber. Inside was no hidden poison or explosive, but something far more dangerous to a man in his position, a tiny, translucent chip. It was the key to the Thorne legacy, the true authority over the hidden accounts and the loyalty of men who moved in shadows far deeper than Van's. He looked at the lead forgery in the ashtray, a worthless piece of trash, and then at the girl. Ilara stood perfectly still, her presence a silent indictment of his life's work. He wasn't the successor, he was the distraction. The Decoy King had finally looked into the mirror and found he was wearing a mask that didn't fit. Van Lake sat back, the weight of the real Obsidian ring feeling heavier than the lead forgery he had discarded. He looked at Ilara, whose calm demeanor in this room of wolves was becoming more haunting by the second. He expected her to demand justice or to spit on his name, but instead, she reached out and touched the edge of the mahogany table with a curious, gentle hand. "My father didn't call you a boss," she said, her voice soft but steady in the heavy silence. "In the stories he told me at night, you were just Van. He called you his lost brother." The name hit Van Lake harder than any physical blow. It was a ghost from a life he had tried to bury under layers of blood and expensive silk. He remembered the nights they had spent in cold basements, sharing a single loaf of bread and promising that the world would one day know their names. Ilara continued, her eyes distant as she recounted the life Silas Thorne had built in the quiet corners of a world Van Lake didn't understand. Silas had become a watchmaker, a man who spent his days fixing broken things and measuring the steady, peaceful passage of time. He hadn't spent his years plotting a bloody return or hiring assassins to reclaim his throne. Instead, he had spoken of Van with a lingering, tragic fondness. "He told me that power is a fever," Ilara whispered, looking directly into Van Lake's weary eyes. "He said you weren't a bad man, just a sick one who thought the only cure was more gold." She explained that Silas had watched Van's rise from afar, not with envy, but with the pity one feels for a man trapped in a cage of his own making. He had forgiven the fire, the betrayal, and the decades of silence long before he took his final breath. Van Lake felt a crack in the armor he had worn for 20 years. He had lived in constant fear of Silas's ghost, arming himself against a revenge that was never coming. Silas had found the one thing Van Lake could never buy with his stolen fortune: peace. The mercy of the watchmaker was a far more devastating weapon than any bullet. It stripped away the justification for Van's cruelty and left him standing alone in the wreckage of a brotherhood he had traded for a lead ring. The stillness in the lounge shifted from a vacuum of shock into a predatory cold. Van Lake felt the temperature drop as the men surrounding him, men who lived by the scent of weakness, began to process the scene. His primary lieutenant, a man named Cashin, who also happened to be Silas's estranged nephew, stepped forward. Cashin's eyes, sharp as a ledger, fixed on the 2 rings resting on the mahogany desk. He no longer looked at Van Lake as a commander. He looked at a man holding a lead forgery, a man whose foundation had just been exposed as sand. The air grew thick with the unspoken threat of a revolt as the men realized the founding eye was a fake, and the true authority lay in the hands of a small, unprotected girl. Van Lake could hear the rhythmic, impatient tap of a polished shoe and the quiet, metallic click of a safety being disengaged in the shadows behind him. These were the vultures he had bred. Men who stayed loyal only as long as the power was absolute and the myth was intact. Now, they saw a boss who was distracted by ghosts and a child who possessed the key to a fortune they had only heard of in whispers. Cashin's hand rested openly on the grip of his weapon, his gaze darting between the obsidian ring and Alara. He didn't see a leader or a family connection. He saw a vacancy at the top of the food chain. Van Lake realized that his moment of internal collapse had provided the perfect opening for the greed he had fostered to turn against him. The predator and prey dynamic had shifted instantly. The girl was no longer a curiosity. She was a target for a man who believed he was the rightful heir to the Thorn legacy. Van Lake knew that every second he spent in silence was an invitation for the first bullet. He had spent 20 years protecting a lie, but in the next heartbeat, he would have to decide if he was willing to burn his entire empire to the ground to protect the only truth he had left. He stood up slowly, his shadow falling over Alara, realizing that to save her, he would have to become the monster one last time. Not for power, but to keep the vultures from tearing apart what remained of Silas's soul. Van Lake stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor like a serrated blade. He caught Cashin's eye with a look that promised a quick and violent end to any sudden movement, then reached down and took Alara's small hand in his. He led her away from the velvet-lined death trap of the lounge and through the heavy swinging doors of the club's private kitchen. The space was empty, the staff having vanished the moment the atmosphere in the lounge turned toxic, leaving behind the clean, sharp scents of rosemary and olive oil. He hoisted Alara onto a stainless steel prep table, her small legs dangling over the edge. Without a word, he began to move through the kitchen with a practiced ease that had long been buried under layers of wealth. He found a loaf of crusty bread, a block of sharp white cheddar, and a cluster of cold grapes. As he sliced the bread, the rhythmic sound of the knife against the wooden board pulled him back 20 years. He remembered a time before the obsidian rings and the blood-stained ledgers, back when he and Silas had sat on a crate in a freezing garage, dividing a single stolen sandwich with the precision of diamond cutters. "You're hungry," Van Lake said, setting the plate in front of her. It wasn't a question. He knew the look in her eyes, the same hollow, quiet endurance he had seen in the mirror every morning of his youth. Alara took a piece of the bread, chewing slowly and thoughtfully. "Daddy said you were always the one who made sure we ate," she whispered between bites. "He said you had a way of finding things when the world tried to keep them hidden." Van Lake leaned against the counter, watching her eat with an intensity that made his chest ache. In the lounge, men were likely already drawing weapons and choosing sides, but here, amidst the steam and the cold steel, he felt a strange, terrifying sense of clarity. He had spent 2 decades feeding a hunger for power that could never be satisfied, all while Silas had found a way to be full on far less. Every bite the girl took felt like a silent reproach of the man he had become. He realized then that he wasn't just feeding a child. He was trying to preserve the last living piece of the only man who had ever truly known his name. Alara finished the last of the bread, her small fingers tracing the edge of the real obsidian ring that Van Lake had placed on the table between them. The kitchen's fluorescent lights hummed, a stark contrast to the heavy, conspiratorial silence of the lounge they had just escaped. She looked up at him, her dark eyes possessing a weight that belonged to someone much older, a reflection of the man who had raised her. "Daddy said you were smart, but you only look at the surface of things," she said quietly, picking up the ring. She didn't pull or pry at the stone. Instead, she pressed a specific sequence on the intricate gold filigree of the band. With a soft metallic click that sounded like a clock resetting, the obsidian face pivoted upward on a microscopic hinge. Van Lake leaned in, his breath hitching as he saw a sliver of translucent material nestled inside a hollow chamber, a high-density microledger. It was a masterpiece of precision, the kind of hidden craftsmanship Silas had perfected during his years as a watchmaker. "He spent 15 years documenting everything," Alara whispered, her voice steady as she held the secret toward him. As Van Lake took the ring, his thumb brushed the internal display, and a faint light revealed columns of encrypted data. Names of shadow directors, offshore account numbers, and the true paper trail of the syndicate's wealth. It was the entire architecture of the empire he thought he controlled, laid bare by the man he had betrayed. The realization was a cold blade to his ego. While Van Lake had been playing the part of the untouchable boss, ruling through fear and a lead forgery, Silas had been methodically dismantling his foundations from a distance. This wasn't just evidence. It was the ultimate leverage, a key that could either rebuild the Thorn legacy or incinerate the organization permanently. He said to give it to you because you know what to do, Elara said, her direct gaze forcing him to look away from the data. The microledger pulsed with the power of 15 years of silent investigation, a testament to a brotherhood that had survived even the darkest choices. Van Lake closed his fist around the ring, feeling the sharp edges of the truth finally piercing through his decades of lies. He wasn't holding a piece of jewelry. He was holding the life's work of a man who had chosen to be a guardian rather than a ghost. Van Lake stood in the middle of the sterile kitchen, the real obsidian ring clutched in his palm, as if its heat could restart his frozen heart. He looked at Elara, and for the first time he didn't see a complication or a messenger. He saw the man who had shaped her spirit. The way she held her chin, the quiet, unyielding patience in her gaze. It was Silas Thorne staring back at him from across a 20-year canyon of blood and bad choices. In those eyes, Van Lake saw the reflection of the man he used to be, a brother who had once valued a shared meal more than a shared bank account. The weight of the microledger in his hand felt like the iron bars of a cell door slamming shut. He realized then that the empire he had built, the high-security lounges, the armored cars, the men who breathed fear, hadn't been a throne at all. It was a prison. He had spent 2 decades guarding a fake ring, hiding from a ghost who had already forgiven him, and surrounding himself with vultures who would tear him apart the moment he blinked. He had traded the warmth of brotherhood for the cold, sterile isolation of power, only to find that the power was as hollow as the lead ring he had discarded in the ashtray. He missed you, Elara said, her voice a soft bridge into his internal darkness. He told me that being right wasn't as important as being together. Van Lake tried to find words, but they were choked off by a lump in his throat that felt like jagged glass. He wanted to apologize to the girl, to the air, to the memory of the man who had become a watchmaker while he became a monster. But an apology felt too small, a pathetic offering for a debt that had accrued 20 years of interest. He realized that Silas hadn't sent Elara here to reclaim the money or the title. He had sent her to show Van Lake the exit from his own gilded cage. He knelt down so he was eye level with her, his expensive suit trousers pressing against the cold kitchen floor. For the first time in his life, the Mafia boss was gone, replaced by a man who was simply tired of the lie. The apology remained unspoken, trapped behind his teeth, but it was written in the way he looked at her with a desperate, burgeoning vow. He had spent a lifetime destroying things to build a prison. He would spend whatever time he had left destroying the prison to build her a future. The heavy silence of the kitchen shattered as the double doors burst open, the sound of splintering wood echoing like a gunshot. It wasn't the hesitant approach of a servant, but the heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots. Cashin led the charge, his face twisted into a mask of cold, opportunistic greed, flanked by a group of men who had traded their loyalty for the promise of the Thorn fortune. The vultures had finally stopped circling. They were descending for the kill. "Give me the ring, Van," Cashin barked, his weapon leveled with terrifying precision. "You've been playing king with a lead toy for long enough. The girl and the ledger belong to the family now." Van Lake didn't hesitate. He didn't look for a back exit or reach for the bag of emergency cash he kept stashed under the industrial sink. Instead, he lunged toward Elara, his large frame moving with a desperate speed that defied his age. He scooped her off the prep table just as the first volley of gunfire erupted, the bullets whining through the air and shattering the glass-fronted refrigerators behind them. He tucked her head against his chest, shielding her small, trembling body with his own. He felt the hot, searing bite of lead tearing into his shoulder, and then another impact against his ribs that stole his breath. He didn't scream. He simply tightened his grip on the child, turning his back to the shooters to create a human fortress of flesh and bone. For 20 years, he had protected his money, his territory, and his pride with a ruthless efficiency. But as he felt Elara's small hands clutching his bloodstained shirt, he realized that those things were nothing but ash. "Stay down," he wheezed, the metallic taste of blood rising in his throat. He looked at the obsidian ring still clutched in his hand, the key to billions, and then threw it across the floor into the shadows of the pantry. It was a distraction, a piece of bait to lead the wolves away from the only thing that mattered. As Cashin and his men scrambled toward the dark corner, eyes wide with the fever of wealth, Van Lake pulled Alara toward the service elevator. He was a man dying of 1,000 bad choices, but for the first time in his life, he was bleeding for something real. He wasn't protecting a legacy. He was paying a blood debt that had been due for 20 years, ensuring that the watchmaker's daughter would have the tomorrow he had stolen from her father. The service elevator groaned as it descended into the bowels of the city, away from the echoes of gunfire and the dying gasps of an empire built on lead. Van Lake leaned against the vibrating metal wall, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts, but his eyes remained fixed on Alara. She didn't look at his wounds with the horror of the world they had left behind. She looked at him with the same quiet, discerning mercy her father had once offered in a freezing garage 20 years ago. The founding eye was gone, tossed into the shadows like the trash it truly was, but the microledger, the real Thorn legacy, remained safely tucked into the child's pocket. In the weeks that followed, the name Van Lake vanished from the ledgers of the powerful and the whispers of the street. To the vultures and the rivals, he was a ghost, a man consumed by the very fire he had started. But in a quiet coastal town far from the smog of the East Coast, a man with a heavy limp and silver hair began to systematically dismantle a world. Using the encrypted key Silas had left behind, Van Lake didn't reclaim the Thorn fortune to build a new throne. He used it as a surgical blade. He drained the syndicate's offshore accounts, funneling the billions into a network of anonymous trusts, scholarship funds, and the rebuilding of the neighborhoods his business had once bled dry. He moved through his new life with the steady, measured pace of the watchmaker Silas had become. He bought a small, unassuming house overlooking the water, a place where the air smelled of salt instead of cigar smoke and spent brass. Every cent of the Thorn legacy was accounted for, turned into a shield that would protect Alara for the rest of her life. He wiped his slate clean not by forgetting the blood he had spilled, but by spending every remaining heartbeat ensuring that the cycle of violence ended with him. As the sun began to set over the horizon, Van Lake sat on the porch, watching Alara play in the tall grass. She was no longer a ghost in a floral dress. She was a child with a future, free from the weight of obsidian rings and the debts of dead men. He looked down at his bare hand, the skin where the lead forgery had sat for 20 years now healed and empty. He wasn't a boss, a king, or a successor. He was finally just Van, a man who had survived his own prison to become a guardian. In the quiet rhythm of the waves, he finally heard the sound Silas had promised him all those years ago, the clear, ticking heart of a life well lived.